I think what we have in this next chapter here, as we move forward, is another interlude. I think we're going to pick up a theme here. And God's going to, over the next couple chapters, reveal to John another part of the story. So in your handout, switch over to session 6 and pick that up. And we're going to go to the very easy, non-controversial section on dragon beasts, protection, and judgment. I don't know how far we'll get here tonight, but we'll begin to dip our toes into these 2 chapters. Or actually, it's more than that. It's 3 chapters. We'll begin to dip into those and see what's happening here. But we're kind of in an interlude here because we're going to see after these chapters, we pick up with another cycle of 7, the 7 bowls of wrath. So we're in here between the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls. So it's like we have another interlude. It's like an interlude within the cycle, within this bigger picture of the cycles, just like there was an interlude within each cycle. It's just an interesting art form here. And this interlude now picks up a trail. It picks up a piece. Remember that little word beast that showed up there? This image of Daniel chapter 7 where the beast is attacking God's people. And this reference to the abyss. And you remember when we got towards the 5th and 6th judgments, there was something, this 5th and 6th trumpets, there was an added element that we didn't see so much in the seals. It may have been there, but not as explicitly as in the 5th and 6th trumpets. When we got to the 5th and 6th trumpets, there was this whole demonic aspect. That the enemy was coming down from heaven and invading earth. And that he seemed to have this demonic force that was fighting us. In fact, it was entering the enemies. Remember that? It was these scorpions, these hordes that came in and attacked the people of God. It's like this whole enemy demonic side was like invading earth. And so we've had this little thread introduced of beasts and the enemy and Satan attacking and coming to earth. And this idea of these creatures that came out of the abyss. What's going to happen in this interlude is God is going to pick up on that thread and say, how are you and I supposed to deal with that? What are we supposed to think of that? I actually had someone talk to me after last week, and they said they haven't been able to sleep all week because of all the talk of judgment. They thought, well, this is it, we're out of here, I'm done. And so it's a legitimate question. I mean, we just saw these horrible trumpets and all these terrible judgments, and now we find out about these demons that are after us, and we're like, what are we supposed to do about that? And so there is like now this story that emerges again from the Old Testament where God begins to say, here's what we're going to do about these beasts that are now turned loose on our people. And let's talk about what that is and what's going on and how we should view all that. And so that's what we have, I think, happening here in these subsequent chapters. So we're going to walk through that progression. There are 5 sections here that we'll walk through. I don't know how far we'll get tonight, but we'll get as close as we can. We first have this image of a woman and a dragon. Then we look at the infamous beasts. And then we move again into the Lamb, the 3 angels. And then lastly, at the end, we have this return of the Son of Man. So as we go into this interlude, we have this first striking appearance. A great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Now, there's an interesting image. It's even the folks that are most literal in their interpretation of Revelation admit that this is symbolic. I mean, this is a symbol of something. What we don't know. There's different thoughts, different ideas, but let's just look at the images here and see what we have here. First of all, we have this idea of clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. Where's that all about? And the 12 stars. Well, I list some passages under there, and again, it seems to me that what John is seeing here is this really condensed image that comes from all kinds of sources. All kinds of Old Testament ideas blended into one image. This is the passage. Remember Genesis 37. It's where Joseph begins to see the image. Remember that? And he has a dream. He had another dream, and it was told to his brothers. Listen, he said, on another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. This idea that he was going to be this great leader. And remember, Joseph now, this son of Jacob, who is the father of the 12 tribes, somehow that somehow in the people of God, they're this royalty that even the sun, the moon, and the stars would bow down to. All right? Interesting thought. Some argue that it comes from the Song of Solomon in chapter 6. Listen to these words. 60 queens there may be, and 80 concubines, and virgins beyond number. But my dove, my perfect one, is unique, the only daughter of her mother, the favorite one who has bore her. The young woman saw her and called her blessed. The queens and concubines praised her. Who is this that appears like the dawn, fair as the moon, bright as the sun, majestic as the stars in possession? This idea that the Lord's beloved is seen in this same image. Possibly, right? Or how about Isaiah 26? The text says, as a pregnant woman is about to give birth, rise and cries out in pain. So we are in your presence, Lord. We were with child, we writhed in labor, and we gave birth to wind. We have not brought salvation to the earth, and the people of the world have not come to life. But your dead will live, Lord. Their bodies will rise. Let those who dwell in the dust wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning, the earth, and give birth to her dead. The idea that somehow God's people are a mother. That to this point, we're supposed to give birth, and they're not doing that. And somehow they're trying to give birth to God's people, but the judgment has kept that from happening. And so here's the image of Israel as this mother trying to give birth in pain. And then we have this other image in Isaiah 62. You will be a crown of splendor in the Lord's hand, a royal diadem in the hand of your God. No longer will they call you deserted or name your land desolate, but you will be called Hephzibah, and your land Beulah, which talks about the fruitfulness and the married beautiful woman. For the Lord will take delight in you, and your land will be married. As a young man marries a young woman, so will your builder marry you. As bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so God will rejoice over you. This idea that the bride of Christ. And so there are all these images that kind of strike from the Old Testament. I've just given you some of them. But this idea that somewhere there's this idea of both the heavenly nature of God's people and also this image of God's people as a mother trying to give birth. So with all these images, and there we could suggest more, basically there's three majority views here about who this woman might be. One is Mary herself, Mother Mary, the Queen of Heaven, as it were, from some traditions. The idea that the one who gives birth to Christ, that's one view. Another view, as we've just seen, is the people of Israel itself, the fact that they are the ones who gave birth to Christ. Actually, it's from his line, from the Jewish line, that Christ emerges. And some would argue, well, not physical Jerusalem, but the Messianic community. In other words, the people who believed and thought that Jesus was coming, the faithful ones, if you will, who were just committed to the coming of the Messiah, who recognize the Messiah when he comes. That's another view. Well, let's look at the text. Let's see how this woman's described and see if maybe we can figure out what John may be seeing here, how it means something to us. Let's look at the details that we have. So put that image of the woman aside, and we'll come back to her in a moment as we see the image unfold. But there's another character interested into the story. Then another sign appeared in heaven. An enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his head. Its tail swept 1/3 of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. We've seen this character before. That was what we saw in Revelation chapter 9, the appearance of this star who comes and is kind of the leader of the evil forces. And again, we see a lot of Old Testament references here kind of jam-packed into one image. Look at this text from Isaiah chapter 27. In that day, the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great, and powerful sword, Leviathan, the gliding serpent, Leviathan, the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea. You will see that throughout the Old Testament, I just gave you this one verse, this idea that there's this Leviathan, this giant creature of the sea, and he becomes a symbol of this evil dragon or this even power. There are this image of this dragon power serpent person, character being that seems to evolve and be shown throughout the scriptures. We see different images of that. In fact, once upon a time, I actually took a class of all these images, and we walked through it. And it starts way back to Genesis chapter 3 with the serpent in the garden. There's this image of this enemy of God that keeps showing up in these different forms. That's what we have here. And then there's also packed into it this idea that these foreign gods were somehow emerged from it. The god of the Nile, look at this. I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, you great monster lying among your streams. You say the Nile belongs to me. I made it for myself. The idea that there's this evil force lurking in the waters of the Nile that's supposed to be a god of the Nile. And so then look especially at Daniel chapter 7. I think this is interesting. After that, in my vision, I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. So if you go back, and that's just one of several beasts. If you go back and look at all those beasts that emerge, what you see is in this one character called the dragon is all the bad stuff from all those beasts combined and rounded up. The idea that he has 7 heads, this big, powerful, all kind of powerful person. 10 horns, a symbol of all authority and political power. 7 crowns, the idea that he was a ruler of many nations. It's all these bad beast traits rolled up into one. This is clearly the one from whom all these beasts gain their power. And so there's all these images to suggest that what we have here is that evil creature that kind of lied beneath the surface of all of the Old Testament. And I just gave you a few verses. They're all over the place. That this is the person we're seeing. This is the person John is seeing. And most especially in the book of Daniel, behind all these evil forces that were all these beasts, this is the one that was behind this dragon. And so it is the perennial fight between the dragon and this woman. Well, who is this woman? What is the battle? Well, here it's described in this way. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snapped up to God and to his throne. We read a passage like this and we're saying, okay, I know how this is Mary. This has to be, right? Because, I mean, this is as close as you could come to a description of Jesus that you could do without naming his name. I mean, obviously, that's exactly what happened. You remember he was born, and all of a sudden Herod sought to kill him. Herod is another symbol of this representative of evil. And so there is this idea that as soon as this male child was born, which, by the way, takes us back, remember, to Isaiah chapter 7. The virgin will conceive and bear a son, and you will call his name Emmanuel, God with us. Remember that? And so you start to say, well, maybe this woman here, we're talking about this battle that happened between the enemy when Jesus was born. So maybe we're talking about a battle in the past between the enemy and Jesus. And then we have this clear reference again to Psalm chapter 2 here. It's quoting, will rule the iron nations with an iron scepter. That's a direct quote from Psalm chapter 2. So clearly we're talking about this Jesus who was almost captured by this dragon right at the point of his birth. So the story begins there, the story of the devil and the woman. So initially it does seem like we're talking about Mary. But then we have an extension of the story. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God where she might be taken care of for, well, there's that phrase again, 1,260 days. Again, could this be talking about Mary? Perhaps. I mean, you remember she got word that Herod was at, and they went to the wilderness. I mean, they could be that. The 1,260 days is a little precise there. It seems to be like we're going to a different place. And so we're starting here with the story of Jesus, no doubt, but we're starting to wonder if there isn't more to the story, that this woman is more than Mary, that she's a symbol that goes beyond the simple experience of Mary. And let's just test that theory. Look at the next slide. Then war broke out in heaven. Interesting. We go from this story, perhaps about Mary, about the birth of Christ, and that she's going into the wilderness, and then we're immediately shifted to another scene where war is ready to break out in heaven. What is that? What's that switch all about? There's something bigger. There's a bigger picture going on here. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. What is that about? Where's that image coming from? Well, again, you have to know the Old Testament a little bit. And again, we're in the passage of Daniel. And Daniel is hearing a vision, and he's praying for how these things are going to be revealed and how God's people are going to remain faithful. And he was praying, and then listen to what happens here. In Daniel chapter 10, you hear this verse. But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 20 days. Like Daniel was praying, he was waiting for the answer, and somebody was coming to give him this answer of what would happen here to God's people in the middle of their persecution. And the angel comes, he says, there was this battle in heaven, essentially. There was some sort of angelic force of the Persian kingdom resisted me for 3 weeks. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me out because I was detained with the king of Persia. Interesting. There was this battle going on. And soon you will learn that the person that he's hearing from, it looks very unusual, this person. Starting to look like this powerful son of man, perhaps. And so there's this battle going on between Michael, the archangel, and the prince of Persia that are keeping God's will from being done. There's this battle that God wants to reveal his plan in the world, but there's these heavenly forces that are trying to hold it back. And a little later in that story, Daniel hears this. So he, this person was spoken to him, said, do you know why I've come to you? Soon I will return to fight against the prince of Persia, and when I go, the prince of Greece will come. Which is interesting. Greece comes after Persia in terms of the world powers. But first I will tell you what is written in the book of truth. No one supports me against them except Michael, your prince. He's saying, I want to tell you what's going to happen. I want to give you the answer. But first I have to go fight a battle, and I'm going to come back. And then the story continues in Daniel chapter 12. He says, at that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress such as not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Aha, now we're starting to get somewhere. There's going to be this huge judgment to come upon the people of God. And there's this heavenly war going on, but the net of that heavenly war is if your name is in the book, you're going to be safe in that battle. Now we're starting to see images that make sense to us in Revelation. See, something is happening in this battle on earth with this son that is born, and the demon and the devil that is waiting, and the child is born, and the woman escapes, and the child is protected. Something in heaven happened when this child came to earth. Something happened when this child is born. What is happening is the very thing that Daniel looked forward to, the victory of God upon earth, and the winning of the war in heaven, so that the forces of evil no longer had power to withhold the plan of God from being revealed. See, something fantastic happened with the coming of Christ. Something changed. The plan of God moved to a new phase. There's a new level of revelation because the Son of God has come in the flesh to tell us who God is. He comes, he lives, he dies, he rises again from the dead. Something marked in history, transformed, that now the mystery and the hiddenness and the resistance of the enemy is vanquished with the coming of Christ. No longer will it be delayed. No longer will the angels fight over this. It is revealed in full. The kingdom of God has come. See, this is a revelation that John is seeing, the fulfillment of all those battles that Daniel saw with this heavenly battle. Now the truth is revealed. And the people are sealed. It's an exciting revelation. Look how the story continues. The battle continues, but look at the net result. Oops. There was this fight between Archangel Michael and the dragon. But the dragon was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil. Okay, we don't have to guess anymore, do we? He says who this dragon is. That ancient, the serpent, the devil, or Satan. Satan is just the word, the accuser, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. See, something happened on the day with the coming of Christ. Satan's power in heaven is done. The victory is won when Christ comes. There's no longer any doubt in terms of what is being revealed. Something is a new revelation of the power of God to us. And so now the enemy has no longer a powerful in heaven. There is no enemy to stand as your accuser anymore because of Christ. That's the incipient idea here. And look how this is going to play out. Do you understand there's nobody in heaven and earth, even the enemy itself, can stand before God and accuse you anymore because of the coming of this Son? Can't be done. See, that's the coming of Christ. That's what he does. And watch how that story unfurls. So he's hurled to earth with all his enemies. We saw it in the life of Jesus, right, where he's always fighting these serpents or these demons because they're on earth doing the will of the one who sent them. Look how the story continues. On that victory, there is rejoicing. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now has come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of God and the authority of his Messiah." There is this announcement that something changed when Christ came to earth, which is very interesting, isn't it? Look at these words. Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. And that's just part of the announcement. If you go back and look at the rest, I would urge you to do that. But it's interesting, I preserved these words because didn't we hear words very much like this a minute ago in the seventh trumpet? And we're like, wait a minute, what's going on here? I thought that was about the future. When the kingdom of heaven comes to earth, what's this about? Is there something going on here that Jesus is born and already there's rejoicing in heaven? How could that be? Interesting that there's a sense in which Christ turned a corner and the kingdom of heaven has come to earth. And we see that already through his ministry. He keeps saying the kingdom is here. See, there's a sense in which there is part of his kingdom revealed now. We have the power now. We have the Spirit now. Everything's there. It's just that the rest of the world hasn't seen it yet or experienced it yet, but they will. God has released his Spirit on the world. He is in this operation of bringing his kingdom to earth right now. The coming of Christ turns an important... Now, that's important for John to see. Because remember, he's in exile. And what the angel is telling him is God has already started the implementation of his kingdom. A corner has been turned here. Christ is born. He's ascended. Yes, the enemy's still out there making a mess, but I want you to hear something. The kingdom has already come to earth in the person of this Son. The Son of Man has appeared. The King has come. And so, John, you're a part of the victorious progress of the kingdom of God. Even if the world thinks you're losing, you're winning. Because God is already at work. Because the enemy's already been cast down. He's no longer in heaven. He has no power. All he can do here is mess around with us and give us grief. But he can't win. So the elders rejoice, or a loud voice rejoices. Now, then again, if we had more time, we could go through the details here. And what you see is that even though the victory has come, the confusing part is the enemy is still biting our heels. And if you walk through this, and I don't have time to go through all the details, but the general picture is that the dragon continues to be a problem. The dragon continues to whack away at the people of God. But that last phrase, 12:17, let me read that one. I don't have that on a slide for you, but let me read that last verse, because that's how that story concludes. Revelation 12:17. Let me go there. It says, "Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimonies about Jesus." See, well, let me back up a moment. I wasn't going to do this, but let me back up a moment. We have a little time. I feel like I knew to explain. Let me read from verse 13. It says, "When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle." Okay, now we've crossed an important barrier here. Mary, as far as we know, wasn't given 2 wings of a great eagle. So something has happened here. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time. There's that phrase again, 3.5 years. Out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. All right, you read that story, I'm like, okay, we've clearly moved on from the Mary story. All right? Unless there's some gospel we haven't got. There is no story like this about Mary. This is a story of Exodus. This is a story about the devil moving on to the people of God in the Exodus from Egypt. And so the devil, he gets mad, and now he's pursuing. But wait a minute, this is about, I thought this was after Jesus was born. And then we have this picture of this woman. What is that about? Why are we going back to the beginning? Well, I think he's trying to make a point about this woman. This woman who we started the story with, that is fulfilled in Jesus, but there's a sense in which it's more than Mary. Mary is a person who comes from this tribe of Israel. Mary is a part of a people of God. She's a part of this larger community of God from whom the Messiah springs. If you go back and look at that Mary, or that lineage of Mary, you see the people of Israel from whom the Messiah comes, and they have their own story of the dragon attacking them. You go back and you see the dragon attacking them in this person of the Pharaoh of Egypt, through this river, through this sea. And you remember, we can all remember that dramatic picture of the children of Israel being delivered through this Red Sea, the enemy trying to put them there to be swallowed up, and yet there God came and created this dry path so they could walk through the sea. And then you remember the enemies came in and the waters came over and swallowed up the enemy. I think this is a picture of God's deliverance, saying, look, just as the enemy tried to take out Mary and her son, listen, the enemy's always been trying to take out God's people. Trying to take out the people who gave birth to the Messiah over time. God has been the enemy, but you see how God protected them? Over and over again, despite the attack of the enemy, God protected them. John, do you remember that? You're from that tradition. You understand that the enemy, as strong as he appears to be, he doesn't have the last word? And then we get to verse 17 that says, Then the dragon was enraged at the woman. He didn't win. And he went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring. Who are the rest of her offspring? You and me? Those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. We're the offspring of this woman. And the enemy is still at war with us. So the idea is the enemy has already lost. The battle's over. He's been cast down to earth. But he's always been in the business of messing with God's people. He doesn't stop attacking. So there is an enemy out there. That's the idea. And so when we get then to the next part of the story, we start talking about how God continues that attack. And so we'll start this story, and I'm not sure how far we'll get before we have to quit, because this is the big one, right? We have a transition now to this part of the story. Now I'm reading for what in this translation is Revelation chapter 20, or Revelation chapter 13, verse 1. Some of the older translations actually have Revelation chapter 12, verse 18. They add an extra verse and put that first phrase still with chapter 12. This particular translation includes it with chapter 13, verse 1. There's nothing inspired about these chapter numbers. They were added later to make it easier to find stuff. So we don't need to get worried about that. But there is this text now. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea. And so we're taken to another venue of this story of the dragon. Now, it doesn't necessarily sequentially follow the end of the last story. It's just picking up the same character and starting at this place. He stood on the shore of the sea. We just heard the story about how God delivered people from the sea through the water. And so there is this dragon standing on the shore of the sea, which is an interesting thought, because what we're talking about is a transition from the sea and the earth. And what we're going to see are these two beasts that are related to sea and earth. We're going to see him just transition of calling something from the sea, which is another way of saying the abyss, the deep. The dragon's going to call something from the abyss and the deep into earth. That's what we see here. In fact, as the verse continues, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea, and it had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. I have these texts from Job 40 and 41. If you go back and look, those are 2 chapters about 2 great beasts. One is the behemoth, the beast of the earth, and one is the Leviathan, the beast of the sea. And one wonders if those 2 beasts aren't on the back of John's mind here, that God is in control of these 2 great beasts. They were symbolized, these powers that were beyond anybody else's power. And then I refer to Daniel 7, because again, what you see here is a beast that rolls up the 4 beasts. And I would recommend you go back and reread Daniel chapter 7 and these two chapters of Job. And I want you to see how this beast is kind of a roll-up of the other beasts. That there was this idea of these beasts that represented in Daniel's dream these successive characters, these successive empires that were coming along. Whether we're talking about, and there's debates about which is what, but they represent various nations, like Assyria and like Babylon and like Greece and like Rome. And so there's this idea of these multiple beasts that Daniel sees, and they all kind of evolve one after another until now we see this other beast that it's in that line. Who is this beast? This new beast that we see. Is he a fulfillment? Is he a succession? Is he found in the story of Daniel, or he is a new beast that went beyond that? We have to figure that out. But clearly it's in that line of these beasts that were there to give the people of God difficulty. And so we begin there. Now, typically when we talk about this section, this beast, we talk about Antichrist, right? This is the subject of the Antichrist, and we begin to talk about this beast. And I will tell you that the word Antichrist does not appear in the book of Revelation at all. It doesn't appear, that word. In fact, the word Antichrist itself only appears in the epistles of John, 1st and 2nd John, not here in the Revelation of John. And so we're going to go back and look at a couple of those phrases, that word Antichrist. Where does it come from? How does that relate to all this? And so, again, since you have nothing to read for next week, 1st and 2nd John, you'll see those words of Antichrist. You also may want to look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, because that talks about somebody called the man of lawlessness. Does that bear any resemblance to this beast? Those are the other areas that are involved. But here in Revelation, it's just about a beast. We don't see the word Antichrist. We don't see the word man of lawlessness. We just see this beast. And the whole challenge is, who is this beast? And clearly it comes from this image of Daniel, these other beasts that were out there annoying and attacking the people of God. And so now we see this story of this dragon who calls this beast, this great beast, out of the abyss. And clearly not a nice guy, because his head was a blasphemous name. So clearly there's something about this beast that is anti-God, for sure. The beast I saw, verse 2, the beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. And the dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and a great authority. Now, if you go back and look at Daniel's beast, you'll see that what we see here is a roll-up of all the beasts into one. This isn't greater than Daniel's beast. Something happened here. All those powers, this is like a bigger power, rolled up into one. And we have this explicit statement that the enemy, the dragon, who we were told very clearly is Satan, is giving all his power to this beast. So this is clearly a very powerful enemy of God. This is the incarnate of Satan, if you will. And all these phrases of these diadems, something is meant to mimic Christ, to mimic his power, to mimic his lordship. Something is going on here that he would be this Antichrist, even if the word isn't used. The idea he is looking like, feeling like, seeming like that he is this great ruler, greater than all the other ancient enemies of Israel, greater than Assyria, greater than Babylon, greater than Egypt, greater than Greece, perhaps even greater than Rome. There is this powerful image, a roll-up of all the beasts. The next slide is a mess up because I don't know what I'm doing. I included it twice just in case you missed it. And now let's just look at the characteristics of that beast. He's wounded but healed. He's followed and worshiped. He blasphemes for, there it is again, 42 months, 3.5 years. He wages war against and conquers both God's people and the whole world. So there's some sense in which he's going to be a world conqueror. These are all huge, huge claims. And so as a result, he leads the people astray. He does something that gets the whole world looking at him. Look at that last statement about the worship, and then we'll talk a little bit about who he might be. All the inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let them hear. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. This is the final sign that there's going to be worship, that somehow the whole world is going to worship this beast except for those who are sealed. Now, who is this beast? Obviously, there are different thoughts. Some people say it is a person. Some people have, throughout time, we've had a lot of people identify this beast as different people. Throughout the Reformation period and so forth, it was the Pope. Everybody assumed the Pope was the beast. He was the one that was destroying the world, right? And he was the Antichrist because he pretended to be Christ. Others would claim it's Nero, and we're going to look at that claim in a moment when we talk about the 666 thing. We'll come back to Nero and whether Nero is the beast. Some people see them historically. Some people see it as somebody later in history. People believed it was Hitler, for example. Or some of you have heard other names, right, of who the Antichrist could be. And we don't feel like having a political discussion tonight, so I'm not going to go there. But people have, throughout history, found all kinds of people that they assume to be the beast. Now, if you're from a futurist perspective, what you believe is that at some point, there's going to be a literal ruler of the world. Many futurists come to that position, that this beast is actually going to be incarnated as a person, that this is referring to an actual world ruler that's going to be a world-domineering person, and that the whole world is going to have to worship this beast. That's one possibility, and who knows, that may be true. So just keep this in mind, that there is this vision John sees of a beast, but who is this beast, and have we seen him yet? Is he still to come? Well, before we answer that question, there's another character we have to look at. Because the two questions are related. The answer to the question of who is this beast, we also have to look at the second beast because they go together. It's a team, as it were. Look at this beast. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. There's also seems to be a takeoff on Christ here, this idea of a lamb. This idea that this servant, but he's not speaking like Christ. He's not speaking like God. It's clear that he speaks like the dragon. And this second beast exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf. So it's like this second beast is somehow a supporter of the first beast. The two work together. He's like his secretary or his supporter or his a co-regent, if you will, in some ways. His prime minister, perhaps. And he made the earth and its inhabitants worship the beast whose fatal wound had been healed. So there's two sides here. There seems to be a political side, and I would say a cultural prophetic side. There's a teacher side and a a person that manipulates people's opinions as well as the authoritative side. The first beast seems to be a political figure. It's all about power. It's all about reigning from the throne. It's all about executing authority across the earth. The second beast seems to be like the culture that supports that power and that authority. The false prophet, the false teacher, the one who lies, the one who deludes, the one who leads astray. So you have kind of this unholy trinity developing of the dragon, who's the power behind the throne, the enemy, and the political beast, who is the authority and the power, and the religious, cultural beast who spreads that lie and deception through the people. You have kind of this unholy trinity that's beginning to, in some ways, try to mimic, reflect, deceive the people as to be the true God. And this is clear when you go through and you read the rest of this chapter, and you see that he serves the first beast. He performs all these miraculous signs, just as we saw some of the other prophets do. He deceives. That's his job, to tell lies. He enforces the worship of the first beast, so he supports the reign of the first beast. And lastly, he mandates the mark of the beast. Okay, what's that all about? Well, I'm going to go through this last slide, and then we're almost out of time. So you're going to have to let me get through this last slide, because I fear somebody's going to shoot me if I don't finish this piece. Or I could make it just come back. No, but I'll do this last slide on the mark of the beast, and then we'll kind of leave it and come back and continue next week. This second beast also forced all the people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive the mark on their right hands and on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which was the name of the beast or the number of its name. Okay, where does this come from? Well, again, look, I put down Ezekiel 9:4. And you remember in that story, what's happening there is God is taking Ezekiel saying, look, this judgment is coming on the people of God, but before it comes, I want you to go out and I want to mark all of my people. I want you to mark all of my people. And by the way, later on, he's going to tell that same person, he's going to see this big temple, and he's going to see someone measuring the temple. And we saw that image before too. And one of the things he tells this angel who's going to go out, he says, go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are in it. So what God is saying to Ezekiel is, in the coming of the judgment, I want you to go mark my people. And we've seen before this seal. We saw reference to the seal that God wants to put on that 144,000. Remember that? And we've seen this other thing of those who are written in the Lamb's Book of Life. We've seen all these references to the people that are in that book, that are sealed in that way, that bear God's mark. What if there's another mark? Another mark for those who are not in. What does that look like? It was common in those days, and it's interesting it mentions slave or free. It was common that a slave was marked with some sort of tattoo or something, either on their forehead, on their hands, so it couldn't be easily hid. Sometimes soldiers or other kind of religious orders would do this to signify their people were part of that rank, so it was, again, a tattoo kind of thing. The idea is that while God is sealing his people, it turns out the enemy is seeking to seal his people. And in this case, there's a seal of this number, 666. Well, what is that? What is that supposed to mean? Well, you've read the news stories. Everybody's afraid that we can't get a chip, because this means that there's a chip injected in us somewhere, and we can't buy or sell. And I remember reading a couple weeks ago, or now it's several months ago, about that company out in the Midwest that you inject a chip and you get all your pizza and your pretzels and your drinks from the vending machines by just having a chip in your hand. And I got a lot of emails from Christians worrying about the end is here. Because people buying potato chips with the chip, you know? And so this idea of, is there some sort of electronic version of this that, well, let's just go back to John's day and say, what would John have seen in this? What would he have seen in this image where slaves were tattooed, if you will? Well, some people think there was a symbol in this number, 666, like maybe it means something. And, you know, people have managed to take this 666 and turn it into other names. Because in the Hebrew, and in the Greek for that matter, but certainly in the Hebrew, certain numbers stood for certain letters. And by picking the sixth letter and rearranging things, you can begin to put them together. And so some clever folks have figured out that if you take the Greek word Nero, rewrite it into Hebrew, and add it up, with Nero Caesar, it would come out to 666. So they said, well, this must be Nero then. So Nero is probably what 666 means. Okay, I mean, I don't know. No one knows for sure. But let me suggest something interesting that I found interesting. This is not my idea. It's been around for centuries. Notice the idea that, didn't we just talk about a holy trinity of dragon, beast, second beast?
Unholy.
The unholy trinity. Did I say holy?
Yeah.
It's late. The unholy trinity of dragon, beast, thank you, sir. Now I won't be fired. You notice how number 666 is not 777? That it's not fulfilled, it's not complete, it's not whole. Some have suggested that we have here an unholy trinity of 666. And so there is this branding that says you're not part of the holy ones. It's short of the one who seals us with his seal. Again, whether that's electronically or whatever, I don't know. But the symbol itself could say that you're not sealed with the seal of the Holy One. You're sealed with the seal of the one who's not holy, who pretends to be holy but falls short. Interesting theory, too. And so as we begin to put this subject together, then who really is this beast? Could it be a future world leader who holds all authority? Perhaps. Does it have to be? Well, I don't know. What happens if what we're talking about here is something that's been around from the beginning? We already saw that with regard to the dragon, didn't we? He's been around since the beginning doing this. What happens if what we're seeing here is the reality that there will always be these political powers, that behind all this, there are always going to be these political powers, like there were in the four beasts of Daniel's time, that there's always going to be this power struggle, and that these beasts are going to show up in different ways and in different places all throughout history. And that there will always be this work of the enemy on earth to exert his authority through this worship of power. I think throughout history, throughout all of history, of the number of people and the ways that people worship power. If I just had more power. You've had that dream. If I were the boss, if I had more power, if I could make the decisions. The world worships power. This is the enemy that chased Jesus into the wilderness and said, do you want more power? There have been many beasts that have risen over the centuries that the enemy has been breathing into those beasts. You want power. Persia was one. Babylon was one. Greece was one. Rome was one. Hitler's Germany was one. We've seen them over and over again. And so there's always been that worship of power. And what about the other side, the cultural side, the lie side, the religious side, the part that supports the power? The lies that we worship and become a part of. That beast has been at work since the beginning too. We saw it the whole way, not just outside of Israel, but within Israel. The lies and the deceit and the false miracles and the false powers and the leading of the people to worship the gods of this world. It's always been there. I wonder if in this vision, what John is seeing is the heavenly dimension of what we deal with on a regular basis. That they're behind all the powers of this earth and all the deceptions and all the delusions and all the cultural mess-ups are these powers, these great unholy Trinity powers emanating from God himself. Or not from God himself, the enemy himself, the enemy of God himself. And so we've already seen this ongoing story of the enemy working against the witnesses, working against the people of God. It's part of the story of God. What happens if this story of these beasts and this dragon is an ongoing story? It's true. We see it. It's happening. Does that necessarily mean that it won't be a world leader someday? It won't be who has a prime minister that, I don't know, it could happen. We came close in World War II, didn't we? It could happen, I don't know. But even if, as we sit here right now, it is happening, there are beasts out there of all variety that are trying to deceive us. And the key here is, whose mark do you want? God is there trying to seal his people against this so that the judgment does not affect them. Our only safety, our only sanctuary, our only hope, our only ability to be part of the community of God is if God seals us and protects us. Apart from that sealing, apart from that work of God, apart from his sanctuary, we are victims of worshiping the wrong beast. Worshiping the beast instead of God. Worshiping the idol instead of the true God. And all of us are subject to that danger. The only safe place is in Christ. But in Christ it is not just a safe place, it is a victorious place. I think that's the promise that we have here. Well, I am well over, so we're going to come back and finish this story next week. Read those passages, come back with all kinds of questions to tell me how wrong I am. So if you remember correctly where we're in this interlude session. We were talking about the fact that we had the 7 churches, that we had the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets, and we worked through all those. And now we're kind of in this interlude space before we go to the next section of 7, which is the 7 bowls. But in this interlude section where we're unpacking the struggles that have been happening throughout all of history and will continue to happen right through the end of history. And as we got to the end of the trumpets, you remember in that 6th and 7th trumpet, we're in that stages where really the conflict between good and evil gets much more intense and much more severe. And we learned that there's a spiritual dimension to that conflict, to the extent that we're talking about dragons coming down and beasts arising. And so this whole interlude is talking about the tension between the fight, the spiritual warfare that's been going on since the beginning of time. And we've seen the 2 sides in that conflict pictured in various ways. We saw this idea of a dragon, which reminded us a lot of the image of Satan from the very beginning in the book of Genesis and how that unpacks. And we see this image of him falling from the sky and so forth, just coming to earth, being tossed out of heaven, something about the crucifixion of Christ, tossing him out of heaven. He no longer has authority in heaven at all. Now he is simply on earth,
continuing to persecute the people of God. And beginning with that image of a fallen Satan who's now on this prowl, we saw these beasts emerge that continue to afflict the people of God. And we talked about, on one level, they are people. They become the spirit of Antichrist, these multiple people that come throughout history that persecute the people of God. And we were talking about this mark that was placed on them when we kind of ended in chapter 13, verse 18, which talks about that mark or that beast, that person. What is this about? Who is this opposition, this beast? And we have this verse that says, "This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. And we talked about this comparison between the unholy trinity of this dragon or this sea creature, this fallen dragon, if you will, and then this beast that comes out of the sea and the beast that comes on the land. And there's this unholy trinity that is contrasted with the holy trinity of Father, Son, and Spirit. And we suggested perhaps one explanation of that number 666 is just that very fact, that it's representing the fact that it's not seven, it's not complete, it's not the same. And it is this 3 sixes to show that there's this different manifestations of evil that tries really hard to look like God, to try to act like God, to reign like God, to have the authority and the power of God, but not God, far short of it. And so the whole contrast there between as you're working in life, trying to see who we will serve, who we will follow, who will be the gods in our life. Is it the unholy trinity of 666, or is the fullness of God in all his glory? And there's always that battle that goes on in our world between which God will we follow, the true God or gods that pretend to be God. And I think that's the tension, and that's kind of where we left off last week. And I said there are these 3 different interpretations of this number. We said sometimes people think it's an individual, that it's a numerical clue for a particular person. And throughout history, it's been different people. For a long time in history, it was thought to be the Pope. Oh, well. That didn't seem to be the case. He never really took over the world, as it were. Other people think it's perhaps Hitler, or as I grew up in history, it was going to be Henry Kissinger. That was it for a while. At one point, somebody thought it was going to be the computer called the Beast that was going to run the European Common Market. You remember that perhaps as you were growing up. Throughout history, there's always been this assumption that there would be this Antichrist. And yet, it's never really happened. Not completely, not fully. And that's why some futurists believe there's still an Antichrist coming, that there's some world leader that's going to come and take over the world. And that's perhaps the case. Other folks have indicated we're talking not so much about a person, but particular empires, reigns, whether we're talking about Rome or the Islamic Empire or the papacy. Again, it seems that none of these things have really happened yet, and some people believe it'll still happen in the future. But perhaps we're talking about a spirit of Antichrist. Perhaps we're talking about something that will emerge time and time in history. I want you to listen to a few verses, one that comes from 1 John chapter 2. The text says, "Dear children, this is the last hour, as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming. Even now, many Antichrists have come." And so we have not just a reference to one Antichrist, but many Antichrists are coming. Also in 1 John, a couple verses later, in 1 John chapter 2, verse 22, we hear the phrase, "Who is the liar? It is whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ. Such a person is the Antichrist, denying the Father and the Son." And here we see it's whoever denies this reality of Christ is an Antichrist. Later in 1 John in chapter 4, we read these verses. "This is how you can recognize the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. But every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming, and even now is already in the world. So there we have John writing this ancient text that says the spirit of the Antichrist, in a sense, the Antichrist is already in the world. This gives us this understanding that it's not just one person somewhere out there in the future, but there's a sense in which the Antichrist keeps reappearing in various forms throughout history. And lastly, we have this phrase from 2 John, verse 7, that says, I say this because many deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh have gone out into the world. Any such person is the deceiver and the Antichrist. So again, a reference to multiple. And so this word Antichrist, it doesn't really appear in Revelation at all. It only appears here in John. And so what I want us to kind of understand is when the same John is now seeing these vision of these beasts and so forth, one wonders if we're talking about a particular person or we're talking about the same reality that he has already seen and made mention of in his other letters, of this spirit of the Antichrist, these many Antichrists, these many governments, these many empires that would continue to come into our world and continue to oppress the people of God. And so that's the battle that constantly goes on now as well as into the future. And so I think we need to keep that perspective in mind as we continue to walk through these images of these two beasts. So those are a few comments that we kind of didn't get to the last time we discussed this. Now, as that interlude continues in chapter 14, now we move to the other side of the ledger. We've talked a little bit about this unholy trinity of the dragon and the beast from the water and the beast from the earth. Now there's another view, and it switches now to a heavenly view. We've seen what emerged from the abyss onto the earth, and now there is this view that switches to a heavenly view. Look with me at chapter 14, verse 1. John looked, and there before me was a lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him were 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written in their foreheads. And so you kind of have a vast contrast here. John had just seen these beasts oppressing the people of God, and now he looks and he sees another. And in contrast of the dragon and the beast, he sees the lamb. This same lamb that he had saw earlier in chapter 4, where that same vision. But now the lamb is on this Mount Zion, which is always a sign of God's presence. This sign of God's decision to come and invade this earth himself. And so now he's standing here at the place of his appearance and the place of his manifestation. And he's standing there on Mount Zion, ready to enter the earth, and he's standing there with 144,000. And we've seen that number before. And we debated, is it a literal number? It seems to be more a symbolic number. The idea of 12 times 12 times 1,000. In other words, the 12 from the Old Testament church, that is the patriarchs, the sons of Jacob. And also the New Testament church, the 12 apostles, the idea that it's 12 and 12 times 1,000. In other words, all the representatives that come from both works of God, the both sides of the people of God coming together, and the Lamb joining with them and coming together as an alternative to what we see here, where the beasts are attacking the people of God. All those martyrs, all those folks that have been faithful, all those ones that have served, they're now with Christ in glory, and we see them in heaven ready to enter earth. That's the image here. And notice this comparison that it was who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads, in contrast to the mark of the beast. Remember, we said that there was this reality where those who wanted to follow the beast in order to do business had to have his mark on it, like a slave or some possession, that they had to be marked by that beast. But in contrast to marking out by the world's power, there is this mark from God, this seal from God that is placed upon us, that we are God's people. And so we saw that was very important, because as the judgment of God was poured out upon the earth, remember, those who are sealed by his seal are protected from that judgment. Now, they still participate in some of the effects of the judgment. They still see some of the damage and destruction of the judgment, but they're not condemned in the judgment. The end of their life is not judgment and condemnation. Rather, they are destined to be secured with God forever because they now have the seal of the Lamb upon them. And so you see John's image now moving from this earth oppressed by the beast to now seeing the Lamb with all his victors, the ones who have overcome, the ones that have survived from both Old and New Testaments there, marked out by God's seal, a vision of all of our destinies, those who follow, who overcome. So that's really where we get this from. And so if we turn then to that song, those folks sing this new song. It's a song that on one level is reflected from the Old Testament. Remember when Moses is delivered, he sings a song. Miriam sings a song. There are many songs throughout Scripture of victory. Remember Deborah and Barak, when they're triumphant over the Lord's enemy, they sing a song. These are the conquerors singing the song. They have been delivered from the oppression of the beasts and the dragon. They have survived. They've come through on the other side. And now they sing this new song of salvation. Hear this word from the Old Testament book of Zephaniah. Hear what he says. They shall seek refuge in the name of the Lord, those who are left in Israel. They shall do no injustice and speak no lies. Nor shall there be found in their mouth a deceitful language, for they shall graze and lie down, and none shall make them afraid. Sing aloud, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. There was always this hope that someday the people of God would be restored and made pure. And so the song that you see in the next several verses, if we had time to read through it and walk through it in all of its detail, we would see these two ideas. That God has made sure his promise that someday he would have this pure people. They would be cleansed and purified from all the effects of sin, or all the effects of evil, that they would be a clean and a pure people, and that in that redeemed and purified state, they would sing their song of victory, just like Moses and Miriam sang their song of victory, just like Deborah and Barak sang their song of victory. The people of God will be protected through this. These tensions, these attacks, these persecutions that John and his fellow sufferers were going through under the days of Rome, all the persecution that has gone on since then, there's this vision of the victorious people of God who one day would stand with the Lamb victorious and sing the song of victory in their purified state. And so that's the vision that God wants John to see, in addition to the trouble and the torment around him. Keep your eye on this vision of victory and purity and destiny of where the people of God shall be one day. Now here in the middle of this interlude, we see song. We see three angels. You remember we heard the eagle come through, and you remember there were three woes in one of the earlier interludes we talked about. Well, in contrast to this, now there are three statements by these three angels. Look at verse 6. It says, "Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. He said in a loud voice, 'Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water.'" So there is this proclamation, just like there were the statement by remember that eagle of the woes. Here are three promises, three assurances with regard to how this is all going to come out. And the first one has to do with this proclamation of the eternal gospel. And some people debate what gospel that is, but in my opinion, there is only one gospel. It is that truth that God intends to redeem his people, that he will have this holy people with him in a holy place to worship a holy God there for all eternity. That's always the essence of the gospel, and that happens through Christ, the work of Christ. So I think there is no other gospel. And this idea that this angel, this spokesman for God, which we take that place, we are doing that. But eventually this whole message of the gospel that will be heard by everyone. And notice that how this gospel is summarized, it says, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water. The idea there is that part of the good news of the gospel is that the end is already decided. Good will win. Christ has been sacrificed so that we can participate in that good. And in a world where good and evil struggle, the good news is that good wins, that God will promise that victory. And the call out to the people here in this world, in this time, that the call out to all of them is now is the time of salvation. In other words, the God who pours out these judgments, who created the heavens and the earth and the seas, the idea is to hear him and respond to him now, so that when the judgments of this is finalized, you'll be a part of the 144,000. We'll be a part of the victorious ones. All these partial judgments that are being poured out now, little by little, here and there, they're a reminder, just like they were a reminder to the ancient Pharaoh, that God is God of nature. God is the creator. And if we want to be participating in his salvation, we need to acknowledge him as God. And so we have that basic truth that God is out there. That's the message that's out there for the world. Respond to that. Then we have a second angel that comes out and says, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adultery. See, there's an other side to the proclamation of the victorious Christ, the victorious God. There's a negative side here, which is judgment. Good and evil will not always exist together. They will not always be mixed together like they are here. Someday, evil will be gone. It will be gone. And it's represented here in this personage called Babylon the Great. Taking this from, listen to this passage from Isaiah, pulling this. Isaiah says, look, here comes a man in a chariot with a team of horses, and he gives back the answer, Babylon has fallen, has fallen. All the images of its gods lie shattered on the ground. Babylon becomes this image of opposition to God. Babylon was the place where God for a time allowed them to come in and punish the people of God. But in the end, God would judge them, and that people would fall. So here we are. The second angel talks about the fallenness of Babylon the Great. Now, we're going to see that again. As we look into the next couple sessions, there's a whole interlude that deals with Babylon and how she has fallen. But right now, this is a complement to this gospel. That is, there's good news, but there's also bad news. If you're on the wrong side of this is bad news. If we're going to rebel against God, there's bad news. God will judge Babylon, this symbol of kind of the master of all evil, the master of everything that's wrong with the world, that symbol of everything that has gone wrong. The understanding is that at the end, that goes away. God will judge that. And then we come to the last angel. In verse 9, a third angel followed them and said in a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and its image and received its mark on their forehead or on their hand, they too will drink the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. See, we're back to that image of who we're going to follow. Do we take the mark of the evil one and follow his ways, or we take the mark of God and follow his ways? The teaching here is that decision is very important. It determines what kind of future, what kind of destiny we have. To take the mark of the beast, to follow that direction, there's only one way that turns out. That's in sure and certain judgment. And here this idea is that this cup of God's wrath, it's going to be poured out in full strength. See, what we now see is drips and drabs of God's judgment, not in its full strength. When we were dealing with the trumpets, we saw a third. Significant, difficult, but not full strength. Just parts of it. When we saw the plagues being poured down on Egypt, it's just partial judgment of God, not the full strength. And all that partial judgment of God, everything we see around us, it's supposed to be a reminder to us and an inspiration to us to look for the God of creation, to look for the one who is in charge of all this, to return to him and bow down before him, acknowledge him as God while there's still time. But someday that partial judgment, that's what the angel is telling, is going to become full. It's going to come in full strength. And it's not just evil over there that's going to be judged. It's going to fall down in all its full strength for those that are just participating headlong in this rebellion against God and his world. That's really what's being spoken here about this angel. And so we have those three angels talking about that judgment and the full strength. That last angel in particular has a fiery message. And we mean that literally. He says, about those people who receive the full strength of God's judgment, we read these words: they will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of holy angels and of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment will rise forever and ever. There will be no rest day or night for those who worship the beast in its image, or for anyone who receives the mark of its name. Now, this is an extension of what it means to fall under the full strength of God's wrath and judgment. This is particularly bad news for those that want to kind of immerse themselves in following the fake gods instead of the real God. Those who indulge in that kind of lifestyle, the torment and the judgment of God is not one and done. It's not just a quick over. No, the judgment of God is something that lasts without end. It's a conscious torment that never, never, never ends. We think of the term Gehenna or hell, and these images of fire and sulfur. That idea of burning sulfur kind of puts you in mind of the Sodom and Gomorrah idea, that this fire of judgment coming down and just never, never, never stops. See, that's the other side of, doesn't sound like good news. It's the other side of good news. Because if good is going to win, then evil must be judged. And if we're going to participate in the family of God and receive the purity and receive the blessing and restore the home of the Father, there's only one way into that community, and that is to follow the Christ who died for our sins. If we continue to insist doing it our own way and rejecting him and rejecting God, the judgment only ends up in one place. This is this eternal place where God has chosen to withdraw his presence. And this judgment will continue. And so it just reminds John of the temporary nature of the fire he's in. The contrast being drawn here is between the fires that we deal with every day, the judgments that we experience, the persecutions, the hardships for following Christ. They're fiery, they're difficult, they're harsh, like the fire that Daniel and his friends had to endure at the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. The fires are real and they're painful, but God is giving to John a vision here of a distinction between the temporary fire of today and the eternal fire of God's judgment. And people argue whether that's literal or not. I don't know if it's literal or not. We can have that discussion, but whatever it is, it's not good. We don't want to be there. And so John is now looking at this fire of his temptation that he's in now, and God is showing him a different kind of fire and say, don't give in. Don't give up. Don't submit to, don't despair and go over to the other side, because there's another fire coming and it's never going to stop. Endure, hold fast, deal with the fires of today, because there's an eternal fire for those that just take on this mark of the beast, if you will, rejecting God and following other gods. And that, in fact, is the final message here that John hears. He says, this calls for patient endurance on the part of the people of God who keep his commands and remain faithful to Jesus. Then I heard a voice from heaven say, "Write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes," says the Spirit, "they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them." The idea here is this promise that the fires of this life are severe, sometimes lead to death, even to death. Remember, John is dealing with the reality of martyrdom, that some Christians had actually lost their lives for their faithfulness to their God. And he's saying to these people, when you die, you are with Christ instantly. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Why? Because from that point on, they die in the Lord. They're blessed. They're with God. They're with Christ. That is not the end of their story. They're free from judgment at that point. They're free from the pain and the suffering and the hardship. They've received blessing at that point. They've received that white robe that we saw earlier, this purity. They're already with the saints in glory, singing that song, that new song of rejoicing. They've gone through the fire. They've gone through the plagues. They've gone through the ocean of judgment. And now they are with Christ on the Mount Zion, enjoying. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them. You know, it's such a great blessing when you see someone who leaves this witness of good deeds. Deeds didn't win them the kingdom. Deeds did not get them salvation. But they've left a witness of good deeds. I tell people all the time that the best gift you can give your family is a life well lived, finished well. Because when they sit to talk about your death and we come together and we try to console one another, if we leave a witness of good deeds, we can console one another and say, they are with the Lord now. They are blessed now. They've earned their rest, as Paul says. They've earned their crown, as Paul says. The best gift we can give our families to finish well and have this pile of deeds, not just good works, but a legacy of witness that we've served our Lord the best we can. You see, this is the promise that the angel wants to hold out to John. Don't give up. Don't give in. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest. The Spirit confirming the testimony. Father, Son, and Spirit working together to ensure our comfort and our assurance in times of trial. So we see that three angels coming through, proclaiming and announcing the reality, the spiritual perspective that we should have on our time here and now. That yes, there is this gospel of good news, but judgment is coming, and the end for us is to be on the right side of that judgment and to keep that eternal perspective, because in the end, things will be put right. See how chapter 14 kind of switched to a new scene here. I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out from the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. This is an image of that Son of Man that Daniel saw in Daniel chapter 7, and I put that reference in here for you to look up. And also a reference that Jesus himself made in Matthew 24. In fact, let me read that passage from Matthew 24, because I think it's helpful for us to see. It says, "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other." See, it's that image of Christ returning. And he is given in that image of the Son of Man that we saw in Daniel, that powerful representative of God who is one of us, who will come and restore us, who will defeat the powers of evil, who defeat the dragons and the beasts, and who will restore glory to God's people. This is what we see. This is an image Jesus himself used to refer to himself, this coming, this harvesting. And the whole idea is of this sickle and this reaping, this idea that he's just kind of harvesting. And those who are his followers will be harvested, and they will get their just reward, their place in glory. And at the same time, there will be much mourning, because when he harvests, some are destined for fire. Some of that reaping are destined for fire. It'll get sorted out in the future, the wheat and the weeds. But that's God's business in the future. But sometime it will happen. Christ will return to put all things right. For those that are alive, yes, and for those that are dead, this reckoning will come. God will separate the wheat and the weeds. He will separate the sheep and the goats. And the warning throughout the New Testament is don't try to do that ahead of time. That's not our job. That's his job. We're just moving forward. God will sort all that one day. We just have to be faithful. And he reminds us that sometimes we're going to be surprised who's the wheat and who's the weeds, and who's the sheep and who's the goats. We think we know, but we don't know. God knows. And so our job is just to remain faithful as we're here, and know that someday there will come a judgment, there will come a reckoning. Remember, this whole thing started when the people of God were praying. How long, Lord, do we have to put up with this? When will this all end? And John now sees this vision of the Son of Man that's coming. That same person, that same lamb that he saw in the opening chapters coming in and breaking open the seals, the Lamb of God who was slain. Breaking open the seals, the will of God breaking out into history. Someday that same person will come, the Son of Man, to close up the whole story, to break open the seventh seal, to break open the end, to bring all things together. That's the story we see here in this Son of Man returning. And I should mention too, sometimes people question why in this particular verse do you have an angel telling the Son of Man to do this? Why is the Son of Man responding to the command of an angel? Isn't the Son of Man, isn't Jesus like Lord of all the angels? And I would say yes. But what we're talking about here is a reminiscent of a reference to Daniel and his office as this Son of Man, this promised one who is coming. And so we have kind of here this declaration that this is now fulfilled in this person, Jesus. And the story then continues. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven. There are a lot of angels, a lot of messengers coming out. Came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came out from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because grapes are ripe." This is the other side of the harvesting, the time for God's wrath to be poured out, and the time of judgment. The collection of the weeds, if you will, the burning of all that. And it takes this, kind of switches to this image now of grapes. And if you're kind of familiar with how this worked in the New Testament times, there were these huge stone vats that they would put the grapes in, and then through millstones or through people walking or through different ways, those grapes were pressed down. And as the grapes got pressed down, the wine would kind of flow down to these other channels down below, so the wine got separated, or the juice got separated out where it was collected and then made into wine. And so it's this image of all this crushing that goes on in the blood, the grapes, the purple juice that flows out of them. It's this image of this judgment, that the blood would just flow. That's really what we're talking about here, that when God decides that it's time and it's over, the blood will flow. Death will be required. And that's the brutal image here that we see when the Son of Man returns. And so we see that then executed, that the angel swung his sickle on the earth and gathered its grapes and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and they flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia. And I have the little note there that that's probably about 180 miles. And if you kind of measure the north and south distance of the land of Israel, it's somewhere around that 180 miles. So the image here is this bloodbath that would go through that whole area up to the height of a horse's bridle. Some people think that's literal, that there will be an actual battle in Jerusalem and in Israel, and the blood will flow that high. I suppose that's possible. But the image is much bigger than that. The image is when the judgment of God is declared, there's a lot of problems. There'll be a lot of surprised people. There will be a lot of blood flowing. It's not a pleasant thought. Which is why I think God has been putting it off for so many generations. The last time we saw that kind of global destruction was at the time of the flood. And there were just a few that he kept back from that. You just can't imagine all the earth dying at the time of that flood. See, that was a warning to all of us, that ancient story. That when God has had enough, and it's the end is the end, and he's done putting up with all the nonsense that people claim is their way and their right, that when that happens, that it's going to be a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth. Whatever that judgment is, whether it's literal or figurative, the point is it's going to hurt, and it's going to hurt a lot. And so that does two things for John. One, he says, again, don't stop believing. Don't stop trusting. Don't stop being faithful, because the judgment is still coming. Just because you don't see it today, you see parts of it, but you don't see the full thing. Don't stop believing how this ends. And the other reality is, that's just why we push so hard about telling the story and about helping people to find the community of God, because we know how the story ends. And so it should incentivize all of us to not just be disciples, but make disciples as well.